Good afternoon, everyone. I
Okay,
am
go ahead.
Jerry Davis from the University of Michigan. I want to thank our organizers, Lauren Whitehead and Michelle Mossman from the University of British Columbia. Today's panel is called Evidence from Implementing Strategies for Aligning Research with Societal Needs. And Lauren and Michelle, for several years, have been catalyzing an effort among leading academics at universities all across North America to change the ecosystem of academic research so as to better align research with the needs of society. And that's really what our panel is about today. In their talks, our panelists shared their experiences from three very different perspectives on how to bring about change and encourage more collaborative work between sort of academia and society. So we have about 45 minutes together. I wanted to give sort of a brief introduction and an overview of what each of the panelists shared, and then give them a chance to sort of share their one top takeaway. And then we have lots of times for questions, both from the panelists with each other, but also from people in the room. So if you have any questions, please just pop them into that Q&A slot, and we will use that to draw out our questions. So first, Carolyn Ponoff is a senior economist and head of secretariat for the OECD Working Party on Innovation and Technology Policy. And in her talk, Carolyn shared what the OECD has learned from efforts at knowledge co-creation, linking researchers, industry, and other stakeholders. She points to 4 factors that support successful co-creation efforts, which included simplified regulatory frameworks, building networks, motivation beyond just financial rewards, and having effective intermediaries. And she shares some policy takeaways for creating supporting co-creation initiatives. Vivian Tseng is Senior Vice President for Programs at the W.T. Grant Foundation. And Vivian leads its initiatives to connect research, policy, and practice around the Grant Foundation's mission. So in her talk, Vivian explains the catalytic role that the Grant Foundation's challenge grants have played in enabling productive relations between researchers and practitioners. She finds that the most effective collaborations are true long-term partnerships where practitioners are involved right from the start in jointly defining what the research agenda is. And Vivian shares both barriers to adoption of this format and also some change strategies that challenge grants have pushed along, including updating tenure and promotion guidelines, the use of seed grants, teaching releases, and dedicated tenure lines for this kind of work. Last, David Hart is Professor of Biological Sciences and Director of the George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine. And David describes the history of the Mitchell Center and its transdisciplinary work on sustainability. The center focuses on real-world problems that the people of Maine in particular encounter, often around the management of natural resources. And sustainability as a topic requires collaboration across boundaries, both among disciplines and outside the university. The Mitchell Center has been successful both in receiving funding and being a go-to for outside partners. They've also become a source of expertise on best practices for stakeholder engagement and transdisciplinary research teams. So the talks were great. I'm sure you all had a chance to watch them multiple times. They were really very thoughtful and full of insights. And I wanted to give each of the speakers an opportunity to just give us about a 1-minute overview of the main takeaway that people can get from their talk, or one of the most important themes that they shared in the video. So Carolyn, can we start with you?
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation and for participating in this panel, and with my co-panelists in this discussion here. So the kind of work or the relation I have to this topic is really coming from the perspective of looking into the value and the importance of the joint production or the joint collaboration between research and other stakeholders, both civil society and industry. And clearly, what we've been doing is looking at really a large variety of international cases to try and understand, well, what are the implications for it? What can policy do? So we are really a governmental intergovernmental forum, and the question is, well, what is it that policymakers can do and to support co-creation, and should they? And there's clearly a number. When you look into these cases, you see the variety of them, and you see the incredible value that can be had from these multidisciplinarity, from the civil society engagement, from addressing societal challenges, much more. And but then getting it right and getting these types of collaborations essentially requires building trusted networks and trusted collaborations, the right context for all of the different stakeholders with very different inputs that they provide to the process to really work out. So they're valuable when they work well, but getting the right context is challenging because it requires trust and it requires stakeholders to be in position to engage. And there's a number of incentives for researchers and for civil society and for others that might not, in all circumstances, really favor that. And so this is really this is where we need to kind of do much more work on the policy side and on the different institutional sides.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And Vivian, what are the big takeaways or insights that people will get from your video?
Yes. Well, I thought, first of all, I would just want to say there was remarkable consistency across all three of our presentations in terms of the power of doing this, whether you call it co-produced research or partnered research or community engaged research, this idea that researchers teaming up with policymakers, practitioners, or communities, that we can really do very meaningful work that's actually impactful in society. And while Caroline's focused a little bit more on the government side of things, my talk focused a lot more on what universities need to do to be productive partners and to fully support the faculty who engage in this kind of research. And it really is a shame that there are so many faculty that want their work to be impactful. They want to make a difference with their careers. And yet the academic system, the promotion and tenure system, what's valued in academia really works against that goal. And so my talk focused a lot on what are the institutional challenges in universities in the promotion and tenure system, where you're valued for your impact on other academics, not for your impact on society or on policymakers. How can we shift those promotion and tenure systems? For example, counting the policy impact of research in the tenure and promotion process, providing training and professional development for researchers so that they can engage more effectively with policymakers and communities. After all, we provide all sorts of other research training in academia. Why can't we provide training on how to do that kind of work as well? And providing monetary support, teaching releases, things like that, so that we can really encourage and nurture the faculty who are doing this work. So that was a lot of my presentation, was thinking more on the academic side, the universities, what can they do better?
Yeah, fantastic. We've been having a little bit of technical difficulty with Professor Hart. So David, I don't know if you're able to join us at the moment.
Hi, Jerry, can you hear me?
Yes, fantastic. David, we are welcome. Delighted to see you with a new set of headphones. That's great. And we're just doing sort of the 1 minute takeaway from sort of what happened in your video and what are sort of the key insights that you wanted people to leave with.
Right, and just double checking, you can hear me okay, Jerry?
100%.
So let's see, I'm sorry I missed a few minutes, but I look forward to catching up. And briefly, I think the take home from the work we've been doing that I discussed in the video is that this is hard work. Vivian said that in her talk. I certainly agree, but that there are a number of faculty, it probably varies among institutions, for whom this really matters. And I think it matters in two ways. For some, I don't know if they were always like this or somewhere during their careers, they decided they wanted their work to matter, and they aimed towards figuring out what that needed to look like. For others, maybe they, like me, weren't as thoughtful about what the barriers to having your work matter, and just kind of assumed that if I do good science, it's going to be helpful in the world, or people are going to use it. And when that didn't happen, they got frustrated. they kind of felt like, what's wrong here? Why isn't this working? And for people that think either of those two things, and they're often related, what we have seen is those are people who are going to be early adopters of this effort to link research with societal impact. There's still a lot to be done, but if you can, my guess is that in any given university, there's a wild guess, 1/10 to way over a third of faculty want to do this, and we ought to start with them because they're yearning to do this.
Yeah, fantastic. I know you mentioned during your talk that there felt like a bit of a generational shift, and I can certainly see that among my junior colleagues that almost everyone under 35 puts societal impact really high on what it is, why they joined the profession, and they're not just going to wait till they get tenure.
Terry, I'm very sorry to say I've lost the audio, but go ahead with others and I'll catch up.
Okay, great. So we had a couple of questions that came up among the panelists and myself when we had our conversations, and then we'd love for other people on the call to paste their questions into the Q&A function. If you see on the right there, it says chat Q&A. Go ahead and paste your questions in there. We'll wait for a few more of those to roll up, and then we can dive into that. But I did want to start with a question for Caroline about hackathons. You talked about hackathons, and particularly during COVID.
Chase, it's David Hart.
This is a totally fascinating period where tens of thousands of articles, if you went to ssrn.com or the various archives for sciences, it's like everyone had a COVID paper in the 2-year period. It's almost like we all abandoned our aversion to public impact, and suddenly everyone wanted to have something to say about COVID. And some of it, I'm sure, was great, and some of it was pretty sketchy. But you described hackathons as a format to address this, and I wonder if you could say sort of what is it? Can you describe this as a format for collaboration, across national boundaries, but also across disciplinary boundaries? And what did that experience teach us?
Yeah, I think we all saw some of those probably surprising developments during the COVID period when it came to engagement and because it required, there was this requirement of quick solutions and mobilization. It was there were a number of hackathons that indeed they were very solution based. So you wanted to identify basic solutions on different dimensions of COVID-19 challenges, some of which international, some of which local. But what was incredible in a number of them is that you had much more of a mobilization because you had a place to go to. You were probably a researcher in a university, like the would like to do something, but you were not quite sure how to engage. And suddenly the hackathon was a possibility of saying, you know what, I think I have this capacity here. I think I can help. I'm gonna show and indicate my interest. And then you had different forms of teams that were being built across different disciplines. You had even also connections with industry being made much more easily, maybe because there was a clear place to go to if you wish to. They provided a place to go to for those who are maybe in universities that were not quite as converted as some of those as David's, when we're going to hear from his example. So who were so I think it was very useful to show that there was actually much more in terms of researchers wanting to collaborate, and there were many more also opportunities being provided from the other side, because suddenly you had policy provide more grants for some of those. You had also more civil society connections with local communities, etc. So it's not just something that it was useful also for others to step in and then support it in that COVID experience. So I think altogether there's a lot of lessons one can learn that on how we can do more of this co-creation by really putting together what are some of these big challenges that we might address at international levels, at national levels, and at local levels. I mean, there's different scales to all of this, but I think it was a particularly I think it was an interesting experience that probably should be given more of a future when we're thinking about these ways
Yeah,
So,
fantastic. And a couple of questions that sort of arose for me. One of them is I am a recovering journal editor, and my worry is anyone can post a paper in an archive. And certainly we are familiar with some pretty bad science that got out there and got a lot of play in the world of podcasts and social media. We won't go into details there, but you know, how does one maintain quality feels like a question. And then David also had a question, which you might want to share about how do you do this in a way that is inclusive? How do you make sure that sort of all of the voices can get heard in this process? And David, I don't know if you had more you wanted to add to that.
Well, I'll say something quick, which is that in America, at least, we're having a lot of conflict about how science fits into society and how it's going to inform decision making. And for that to sort that out, we're going to have to spend a lot more time engaged in conversations with diverse stakeholders to understand what they're trying to do, what their values influence the goals that they have, and how to make that all work together. So I do think that's going to be very challenging.
Maybe I could add just a thought here on this, which is that I think it's wonderful. We're in a time of innovation and experimentation with how do we bring researchers, practitioners, communities, policymakers together to do a different kind of research. And we're not going to, I don't think there's probably going to be any one strategy that's better than all others. So I love this idea of a hackathon. I would say, though, other strategies involve more of the deep relationship building with a particular set of policymakers or practitioners. When I heard Dave talk about the work that's done at University of Maine, it's also very place-based. It's right. It's very much about a sense of service to the local community or communities and what they need. And because universities have had fraught relationships based on race and settler colonialism and all of these things, there's a real need there to build trust with local communities, right? In order to do the kind of research that's trusted and then sort of pouring the intellectual expertise of academia into the service of community. So I think there's an array of different ways to go about it. And that kind of way to do it can sometimes be better for certain kinds of researchers, and whereas others like to be the more public scholar, right? The face, the Twitter person, you know. And sometimes folks who are more, you know, don't mind being in the back of the room and having this sort of quiet conversations with communities or decision makers to do research that meets their needs. So there's an array of different ways for academics to get involved.
I wonder if you could say a word about, so that we getting some great questions about sort of intellectual property concerns and which kind of hackathons work better and worse, and sort of can we create some assessment system to figure out which formats are yielding better and worse outcomes. So Vivian, you have been catalyzing this kind of collaboration that we're looking for in really intriguing ways. And I wonder if you could say a word about what stands out about universities that are really good at this, since many of us on the call are university scientists, social scientists. Who's really good at this, and what are they doing to enable this kind of collaboration? To say, "Yep, you worked on a hackathon, that counts."
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know that there's any one university that I feel like is such the exemplar, but I think there's lots of wonderful things going on in different universities, and we should be aggregating some of those lessons learned across different universities. I think the work that Dave Hart is doing, which is more of a center-based strategy, right, at the University of Maine, is a wonderful example, because what it does is it also brings a home, because researchers who do this need a place, like they need a meeting ground to come together and have a sense of community, especially when the larger academia doesn't reward this work and doesn't train people to do it. Other universities like UC Berkeley just recently issued guidance university-wide across departments to say, this is how you can count community engaged research in the promotion and tenure process. First of all, you can count it, and then here's some guidance on how you can count it. So for those faculty in the university who are doing it, they can get rewarded for it. Cornell University in the College of Human Ecology, the dean just established an associate dean position for community engaged research to work on growing that as an area of work at Cornell. UC Irvine, University of California at Irvine, has established a research practice partnership position. It's a tenure track, tenured position. The University of Colorado has not done this yet, but they're in conversations about creating a faculty line called a research practice partnership faculty line. Now, who knows whether that will happen, but these are great ideas that are bubbling up from universities across the country. I think it's worth lifting them up and learning from them across the country.
And one of the questions that we got in the chat was about the tenure and promotion process and how it overinflates standardized impact measures. I have to say, just here among friends, that the fact that Google Scholar has become the monopoly provider of impact metrics is terrifying. I don't know if you've been tracking this, but Microsoft Academic was a really fantastic product that I thought was really thoughtful. They put real resources into it, and they closed it at the end of last calendar year. Microsoft and Google are the only ones that get waved into every server to scan them. And so we pretty much are reliant on Google Scholar to know what the literature says, which this is the time of anti-monopoly movements. That one feels a little sketch to me. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression there. But in my experience, it's pretty rare to read tenure letters where someone doesn't mention Google Scholar at some point. And I think, are there metrics that you have found to be useful or productive, most helpful at trying to get at societal impact beyond just Google Scholar counts or sort of Clarivate metrics? I mean, are there metrics that you think actually do the trick, that aren't gameable or that are productive? This is for anyone that wants to answer.
Well, maybe I could start, and I'm sure Caroline and Dave have other thoughts. The Grant Foundation has a whole grant portfolio on studying the use of research evidence. So it's the science of science use. And one of the important strands of work there is trying to develop stronger measurement systems so that we can actually measure when and how research is used in policy or practice. But what I would say is it's that area of research has come very, very far in the last 15 years, but we're still have a long way to go to develop a scalable, easy set of metrics that can be deployed at scale. So I would say that. So I think there is promise there. I hope that more folks are going to get involved and try to assess this stuff. But it's not at a place where I'm yet comfortable suggesting that universities adopt it in their P&T systems. That said, that's quantifiable metrics. I would say there are many other ways to collect data on social impact that are different. So for example, and you can think about letter writers. You can ask letter writers to comment on the policy or community impact of someone's research. They comment on the academic impact, the academic content, they could comment on that. And then you could also think about who's asked to be letter writers. Maybe not just the fellow academic leaders, but perhaps also policymaker or community partners could also be invited to contribute letters to comment on the impact of that work. So I think there are pretty simple modifications that can be made within the P&T system to allow ways for evidence of broader social impact to enter into the promotion and tenure process.
And David, sort of lying behind this question about promotion and tenure is this a risky strategy? And maybe you could share a bit about the Mitchell Center's history with this. In your talk, you described how you've had really great success in seeing junior faculty come up through the center doing interdisciplinary collaborative work with the community and getting rewarded for it. So maybe you could say a bit about how that's worked for you, and maybe whether it would transfer elsewhere.
Well, Jerry, you're right that when we started, the National Academy came in and actually 3 members gave us advice about how to do this work. And they differed. One was an engineer, one was a natural scientist, one was a social scientist, but they all seemed to be saying, careful not to let your junior faculty do this work till they have tenure. It's too risky. And goes back to the point I made earlier about faculty that really want to do this. We had a lot of them, even when they were junior faculty. And so we said, maybe we shouldn't tell them not to do this, but we should try to figure out how they might be able to manage the risks of doing it. In fact, not just them, but us as a partnership. So we've done pretty much everything imaginable to help them navigate this. And it varies by individual, by department, by school, by college within our university. But we spend a lot of time helping these faculty understand how their peer committees are going to look at things. I've been the kind of person, just like Vivian said, who says, let's make sure for our tribal partnerships to turn to our tribal partners to provide letters of support for these packages when someone goes up for tenure. And whether we're talking to the peer committees, the chairs of departments, the deans, the vice presidents for research, the provosts, or the presidents, and by the way, all of those conversations have taken place in some instances, they're really meant to make the point that all of you are talking about the value of this research and both kind of ways to quantify it, but also to understand using qualitative assessment what's important. And just to go back to the hackathon, because I was still having technical problems back then. So here's a very different kind of a story. 15 years ago, when I arrived in Maine, I could see that there were fraught relationships between the university and our 5 federally recognized tribes. And there were good reasons for this based on the tribal experience. So we started talking. We brought new faculty to the University of Maine that are citizens of tribal nations, Maine's tribes. We brought more students. We built many deep collaborations. We've just published a paper last year that has 12 authors, 8 are tribal members. It describes 15 years of work that honestly doesn't look like we're setting a speed record in publishing papers based on this, but that's the pace that made sense for that set of collaborations. And I think it goes back to a point I made earlier, which is that alone isn't going to get somebody tenure, one paper in 15 years, right? So we're going to have to both find people who want to do that work no matter what. And then I think in centers and other places in universities, like Vivian was saying, we're going to want champions and coaches for the people that lead this work to help them make the case for its value. And if anybody wants to know more, go Google, sorry about Google, Science in Indigenous Homelands. And that's that story of 15 years of collaboration, which didn't always go smoothly.
Say a word about how well the lessons from the Mitchell Center and what happens at the University of Maine will transfer elsewhere. So Vivian's mentioned some universities that have got a head start on this, UC Berkeley, UC Irvine, Cornell, and sort of Maine, you've got like a lot of history and some pretty great outcomes from what you've been up to. Will it work elsewhere?
Well, going back to my point about if there are faculty in the world that think this work matters, that's a huge factor that's going to determine whether this can take hold in many different contexts. Of course, the perfect world is one where there's complete alignment with the top-down leadership of a university that values this, with the yearning and capacity of faculty and others to do this work, right? I don't know that it always happens that you get that perfect alignment. So I'm kind of rooting for the bottom-up strategy, because over time, that could itself become a social movement? In other words, if there is another generation, Jerry, you sent me an email about this, do we have young faculty where the percentage of them is growing that think this kind of work matters? You know, you can achieve academic success in a lot of different ways, but I talk to faculty all over the world who increasingly say, I want my work to matter. Of course, we have a lot of work to do to make that easier for them. And I think that's why I so admire the Institutional Challenge Grants program that Vivian and her colleagues have developed, because that's really trying to align the whole system. But I talk to people all the time, and they want to know more about what we're doing, or we want to know what they're doing. And what we're seeing is that there's more and more experimentation in trying to make this work. And back to a point that I think is really important that Vivian made, we need to study what's being learned across a whole range of institutions to see, you know, come up with a multiple regression model of all the factors that influence the kinds of outcomes we might hope to see.
Great. I'd love to shift gears a little bit here. We had a question early on, and I think this is probably for Caroline. So you work in the real world of policy. So you're an academic economist who has influence on the world, which is, I think, maybe a bit more normal in economics than in some of the other sciences, social sciences. So one of the questions was, are any of you involved in getting scientists in academia formal training in policy? And what does that training look like? So Caroline, maybe you could share your own experience about that. And you know, how hard is it? What kind of training can one get to be effective in the world of policy?
As in anything in life, there's no one single recipe for these types of facts. I think the first and important issue, and something that is relevant, is probably to get those types of to get some to foster and promote this type of openness that all of the researchers that you are describing, David, and that you are describing, Vivian, already have, right? So they're already looking for an impact, and they're looking for what is it beyond my own immediate research and my kind of my narrow field of expertise that I bring to society. And as soon as you have this type of perspective, I think you have an idea of what is relevant to somebody coming from the policy side. And what I think is important here is as well to have much more of this type of dialogues than what we often have. So so having a bit more of this type of exchanges. So what we quite often will have when we have these types of discussions is that we bring practitioners who talk about their initiatives, and then we bring somebody who's designing a policy program that aims to, let's say, you know, at the country level, to say, okay, this is we want to have more of this type of collaborations. And then what we try to support is a dialogue between the two sides, where maybe the policy side doesn't quite understand what's happening on the ground, or misunderstands some of the issues. I think what David was saying is it's very often not just a question about grants. It's maybe more like having some champions and some promoters and role models and people you can follow. It's not just about here's a grant and then go ahead and do more of it. I think it's much, you need more this kind of support context, leaders, champions, and that are important, and that you might want to be thinking about when you're coming at it from the policy side and you're trying to say, I want all of my university to do a bit more of this. So I think it's more this type of it's more in that type of area that I would say that it's the dialogue between the two sides that one should be promoting. But that's kind of going a bit in the direction of what the question was looking for.
No, that's great. And Vivian, in your talk, you sort of perfectly described my situation, which is, well, I've done this brilliant research. Now I just need to do a interpretive dance to convey it to the public, or say it louder, or say it 3 times so that they get the really important insights that my research has to share. And you do a very thoughtful job, I think, of conveying why that's not exactly the case. Maybe you could share a little bit about that and how you think about the most effective way for researchers to connect with policy.
Yeah, I think the thing I would do is to say perspective taking. The most important thing any academic could do is try to learn, what does the policy making world look like? What are the pressing problems and concerns that they have? You know, we're used to formulating research questions based on what we think the research literature says needs to be studied, right? We're not used to like diving into, what do policymakers in the policy context, what do they think need to be studied? You could say the same thing with communities. What would communities say are the most important things? So learning about that, learning about the policy process, how does policy get made? Who are policy decision makers? What is under their authority? What can they do? What do they need to think about making decisions? Because if we want to do research that's useful to them, we have to understand their work. So that's where the relationship building becomes really useful, developing relationships so that we better understand their needs and we can have some iterative dialogue over it. I've put into the chat a couple of organizations that provide some training and insight to researchers who want to do this kind of work. But what I would say is the training and that stuff is useful as sort of starting. But then really getting into the relationships, that's really helps. And then the thing I heard Dave say in his talk was learning by doing. As with anything we do, the more we do it, the more practice we get, the better we get at it. We don't learn, quantitative methods or experimental methods in one project, in one study. We do it through a lifetime, career of work. And the same thing for doing research that informs policy. It's got to be a long-term commitment. And as we do it, we will become better at it. That's my perspective on
it. That is great. So we've had some great questions from the audience, and I wonder if any of you wanted to ask each other some questions. So we've been in conversation for a bit now. What kind of questions or mysteries or conundra has our conversation raised for any of you?
Actually, there was one topic that was quite interesting, and that came also, I think, in some of these chat questions, which is about who's driving the research agenda to start with. Because one thing is, I'm sitting in my office and I have this brilliant idea and I go ahead and just do this and I think it's going to be good for everyone. And then I go out and say, I have this good thing for you and you need this. And now I'm going to sometimes not even in quite this kind of exaggerated way, but you think you're having a great idea or whatever, you have some inspiration and you think it's going to help others. So about the real ways of maybe doing it the other way around and thinking about, well, and coming to things with a more open mind and being able to do that. That sounds like, it sounds like, I think, easier than it actually is to do that. For a lot of reasons, maybe because your research, your own biases, but maybe also in your field, there's a certain direction that, or there's a certain lemma direction in which things should be going. So I find that quite an interesting thing about the research agenda itself, and not having it go too much in the direction where it will then, in the end, not benefit so much, or benefit some groups more than others. I mean, we have a lot of history, for example, where we know that medical research has been terribly biased from a gender perspective, for example. It's so these types of issues are quite interesting. My other panelists who have experience in some of these parts have had some approaches, and how do you get a different start at who's driving the research agenda.
So maybe I'll just say that when we do our work, we often struggle with the kind of challenges that Caroline described in terms of basically, I had an undergraduate in a class recently who I was surprised at how, I don't know, sophisticated his thinking was. He said, maybe researchers should put their own interests on the back burner sometimes. I thought, who is this kid? Right. So I'll give you an example, though, because I know I have trouble with that. But I worked hard to get some new faculty at our university who were tribal citizens to do this work that I mentioned. I figured, well, they totally know the tribal world, and they were researchers, and they went to work with the tribe on some issues that they were pretty sure mattered to the tribe. They were wrong. In the discussions with the tribe, they realized they thought there's some issues about forest management of tribal lands. And in the course of the conversation, the tribal partners said, it's not that stuff we're worried about. We're worried about an invasive forest pest that is working its way across the country and is going to destroy the very tree that is part of our creation story. This guy was he's a friend of mine, Darren Ranko, anthropologist, knows nothing about forest pests, could have just walked away from the collaboration and said, well, I don't know what to do. 15 years later, we're still at it. He reassembled a team, refocused the research. We're still having the problems with the forest insect pest, but this is a deep collaboration that's just going to go forever. And it's going into other directions because there's other needs. So it's kind of like it evolves in really important ways. So to me, that's a story of how challenging this is. But if you can figure it out and really listen, you can make a difference.
And I think that's the key word, is listening. Not going in as the expert, this is what we think needs to be known, but going in listening to what do others feel like would be helpful to them. What are the nature of the problems they are facing? What are the nature of the dilemmas that they're trying to sort through? And then how do we how do we work with them to craft a research agenda around their needs? So that listening, maybe some training around listening to policy problems might be helpful.
In hearing your responses, it sort of sparked a realization that we're talking about user-centered design here. There's an entire practice around user-centered design, not I've come up with this brilliant invention, now I'm going to go find someone that wants to buy it, but start from the needs and work backwards. And you know, Vivian, in your talk, you were pretty emphatic about this, that you involve stakeholders from the get-go, like from the start, in defining the research agenda. And that really does feel like we are replicating the insights of the world of design thinking and user-centered design. Start from the need, and rather than come up with the invention and then try to find an application for it. So fantastic. Do we have any last questions that we might throw in here? I'm going to put in the chat, by the way, our group is going to be doing an afterglow. So if you want to get yourself a cocktail, a coffee, a ayahuasca, whatever your preferred beverage might be at this time of day, pasting the information into the chat here. But are there any other last words or questions from the panelists?
I would be curious to hear from Carolyn and Dave thoughts about how to make these relationships long-term. You know, so they're also not fleeting moments of collaboration. You know, and I have a bias that fleeting moments of collaboration don't often solve the big problems that we want them to solve. So I'd be curious what you've learned about how to do this for the long term.
So my quick answer goes back to a point I made before. If you have faculty for whom this just matters as a core ethos to do this kind of work, even when their grant runs out, they'll find other ways to keep it going. So at our university, I have lots of colleagues who have a grant, it goes away. Then they say, well, I'm going to be teaching a course. I'm just going to get the students to work on this for the next 2 semesters until we get some more funding.
All right.
From my side, I would say like another part that that helps us with thinking about things over the longer term is in some way trying to institutionalize some of it. I mean, not institutionalizing it in a narrow sense, but trying to give it some natural way where it is anchored. Otherwise, it's likely going to be my personal relationship with somebody else I had a good relationship with, and that those things will risk not being that lasting. So I think that's another short.
Thank you so much. We are right at time now. This has been, for me, a fantastic conversation. I recommend to all of you, if you haven't watched them yet, the 3 videos are really full of insights. I really got a lot of value out of them. If you'd like to join the speakers and myself, I pasted the Afterglow link into the chat. There we can also meet up with Lauren Whitehead and Michelle and have a broad conversation about these themes in a more relaxed setting with easier to use technology. So thank you all for joining us today. Really enjoyed this session. I hope to connect again. And thank you, panelists.